1962. It had been 5 years of turmoil for the five families. Public slayings and shamings, coups gone wrong. By this time, the families were led by Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, and Vito Genovese. Genovese remained one of the most feared and powerful bosses on the commission, despite getting nabbed on a drug charge back in 1958.
Charges are fantastic and ridiculous.
While in prison in Atlanta, Vito Genovese feared that a member of his own family, who was also serving a lengthy sentence, might be tempted to flip and turn state's evidence to betray Omertà. The member's name was Joseph Valachi.
Joe Valachi was a two-bit hood in the Genovese family, and he got arrested on a drug charge, and it wound up that he was in the same prison in Atlanta with Vito Genovese.
And at some point, he either gets tipped off or he gets the sense that he's run afoul of Genovese and he's going to be killed.
The story is that Valachi believed that Genovese had fingered him for assassination.
He said, you know, sometimes you buy a barrel of apples and one of these apples is touched. Not all rotten, but a little touched. He said, that apple has to be removed, or it'll touch the rest of the apples. Grabbed my hand and he gave me a kiss. This is a suspicious kiss. The kiss of death.
Valachi suspected that he was going to be set up for murder, and he suspected one guy in particular was supposed to kill him.
I made one lap of the yard, is about, I say, 4 blocks long. Then I made another lap, and then I made another one, and then on my way back, I spot Joe Beck. Well, he was walking with another guy, see? And right away, I saw the pipe, I grabbed the pipe, and I went to wake on Joe Beck. I hit him on the head with the pipe, very hard. Well, then I saw a couple of guys running towards me. They made about 2 attempts before the officer come over, see? All the way to the Associated Warden's office. He showed me a picture. I said to him, who's this? He says, that's the guy you hit. You could imagine how I felt. I sank in a chair, you know. I told him, just lock me up.
It turned out it was a case of mistaken identity. Killed the wrong guy. The person had nothing to do with any planned hit. Commit a murder in prison, you're really going to face a lot of trouble.
And so he goes to the authorities and says, in exchange for protection and keeping myself alive, I'm willing to talk. And so the FBI takes him in, they interview him, and before long, he is before a congressional committee.
The story of Joseph Valachi's testimony today before Senator McClellan's investigating subcommittee.
Valachi is going to commit the greatest sin of a mobster, which is to break the code of Omertà. Omertà is the code of silence. We do not talk to the law. We do not talk to outsiders. All of our business is private.
A convicted hoodlum whose confessions to the FBI have reportedly put a price of $100,000 on his head.
And Valachi breaks that code. Yanks the curtain back on all the secrets of what the mob is.
For more than 30 years, law enforcement and the American public had extremely limited information when it came to the Mafia and how it operated. Now, for the first time, their questions would be answered.
You solemnly swear the evidence you should give before this Senate Select Committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
He actually disclosed that there were 5 families in New York. He put on the table that the Mafia and 5 families existed, and here were their names.
Are you a member of any such organization?
Yes, I am.
What is the name?
I was.
What is the name of it? It is
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Our thing and our family in English.
Our thing and our family in English. We'll come back to that later, but that is an organization, is it?
Yes.
That requires absolute obedience.
Yes.
And conformity to its policy as handed down by those in authority.
Yes.
Why do you feel like it should be destroyed?
Well, through the years, first of all, I want revenge. Second of all, they've been very bad to the soldiers. And they've been thinking for themselves all through the years. As the senator put it before, what did I get out of it?
What'd you get out?
Nothing but misery.
Misery was right. And for New York's 5 families, there would be much more of that to come.
Good afternoon. What set off this latest round of crime hearings by the Senate's Permanent Investigation Subcommittee was the existence of one Joseph Valachi, 60 years old, convicted dope peddler, convicted murderer, and one-time member of the Mafia, or Cosa Nostra.
He testified about the Mafia, about Omertà, about the structure, who is who, about Genovese, about all the stories.
Well, we might ask you at this time, what are the different positions in that organization? Starting at the top, what do you have?
They used to have what we call the boss of all bosses.
The boss of all bosses. All right. You say now, however, there is a commission. Does it now have a boss of all bosses?
No, no more boss of all bosses. We have what we call a commission. Charlie Luciano, Charlie Lucky put it in effect. And we had the individual bosses of the individual family. And we had an underboss. And we have what we call a capo-regime, which is a lieutenant. And we have what we call soldiers.
Soldiers?
Soldiers.
Joe Valachi created a storehouse of knowledge, facts, impressions about the structure of organized crime in the United States.
Joe Valachi's testimony to the United States was a seminal moment because he gave concrete evidence of what these families actually were. That he actually names names of bars that the Mafia owns. And so he makes it real. And he also tells, about all their secrets, the initiation ceremonies, how somebody was made a member. He talks about killings. He really does not hold back.
Well, this is a secret organization. How do you get to know that somebody is a member of the same family?
He'll introduce him to you, for instance, as a friend of ours. That means a member. Now, if he happens to be with someone that isn't a friend of ours, he would just simply say, meet a friend of mine, which means nothing. That's the code between us.
So there was a code that enabled you to identify other members of the family?
Yes.
Did you do anything for the family at all in this time, or did they
well,
just do things for you?
Just go out, kill for them.
You'd go out what?
Kill for them.
And so the gangsters were, there is absolutely abhorrent to them to have all their secrets spilled out into national TV.
Valachi really does create this path forward for any mob turncoats. And what he does is shows that there is a way to become an informant and still survive, that there's a life after for anyone who wants to take that path. And, we'll see that this continues to happen. After Valachi does it, the You know, floodgates in a lot of ways are open for the federal law enforcement and law enforcement in general to take advantage of people who are willing to break the code of Omertà.
Joseph Valachi would die in federal custody in 1971, but his testimony would be studied and scrutinized by law enforcement and journalists for decades. From the outside, Valachi's betrayal of Omertà provided the public with a glimpse of what life was like inside the Mafia. Amongst members of the five families, his testimony was a grim reminder of the looming existential threat to their way of life, Omertà.
For a soldier, as you all understand, once you're in, you can't get out.
In 1957, the five families were nearing 30 years of existence in New York City. 30 years of success, largely because there had been 30 years of relative peace since the murders of Joe Miseria and Sal Maranzano. No bloody turf wars, no public slayings. Conflict was dealt with in the shadows, and members had, for the most part, upheld their oath and stuck to the rules. But that was about to change. Frank Costello had been boss of his family since 1937, much to the displeasure of the family's underboss, Vito Genovese. Genovese thought the seat should be his, and the tension began to boil.
Genovese and Costello were working together. They probably respected each other. I don't think they liked each other.
Frank Costello brings more of a businessman air to the role. Dapper suits, nice-looking guy, well-coiffed hair, knows how to deal with people in high places, knows how to deal with politicians. Genovese is a bit more rough around the edges. He's a bit more shoot now, ask questions later kind of guy.
Genovese, he tried his hand at a number of legitimate businesses, but unlike Costello, didn't do very well. He had a poultry business, a liquor business, a gambling boat venture. They all failed. But he had control. He was a vicious guy, more vicious than Costello. And people, gave him the deference.
So when Genovese sees Frank Costello sitting in the seat of power, he's like, well, that's not fair. That's supposed to be my role. I was the guy that was under Lucky Luciano. How dare you sit in my spot?
So there was this envy, I would say hate, but it was just maybe good business sense on Genovese's part to try to get rid of Costello. Frank Costello was having a dinner and coffee at some Upper East Side restaurants not far from his home on Central Park West. And he had to go back home. He got into the door of the apartment building, and I heard famously, "Frank, this is for you." Frank turned his head. Instead of hitting straight on, sort of grazed Frank's turning head. And the shooter fled.
Costello survived the attempt on his life. When questioned by police after, he claimed he never got a good look at the shooter. But even if he had, it wouldn't matter. The commission rules still held. Omertà. The Majestic's doorman, however, did not live by the same code. He got a good look. And when presented with photos by investigators, he identified Vincent Gigante.
Gigante was, according to our information, a protege of Genovese. He was the bright boy. He was the rising star of the underworld.
My name is Rita Gigante. I am the daughter of Vincent Gigante. Someone came to Vito and said, look at this kid, he's promising. He knew he had to do something to prove himself, but he liked Frank, and he missed. I don't think he really, in a sense, wanted to do that.
Frank Costello would later testify that he didn't have a good view of who the shooter was. The story that I heard was that as Costello was leaving the witness box, Gigante supposedly said, "Thanks, Frank." After that, they actually became friends. Costello had Gigante over for dinner and drinks at his apartment. The hatchet, so to speak, was buried. But this all sort of created the thought in Costello's mind that, hey, maybe I should step back and, if I want to survive, sort of retire.
Frank Costello would relinquish control of his family to Vito Genovese and fall into the background. He would not seek revenge in the streets or on the witness stand. He'd uphold his end of the deal, put the family first and follow the code. But Genovese's brazen act did not go unnoticed by the other bosses. Albert Anastasia lobbied the commission to approve a hit on Genovese, and tension got high. On the brink of an all-out war, Joe Bonanno, the secure leader of his own family, mediated a peace agreement and successfully settled the ship. In the aftermath of the intervention, Bonanno declared himself the capo consigliere, chief counselor of the commission. It was a made-up title, but enough for Bonanno to believe he was above the law and above the rules, especially when it came to drugs.
The rule was they didn't deal in narcotics, but the other rule was we make as much money as we can any way we can. So in the late 1950s, America has a heroin market, but it's very small. Heroin was made illegal in 1924. So there's a black market opportunity here.
Joe Bonanno is definitely looking to increase his power and increase his financial stake in the commission. For him, the 1950s is a good period for that for a couple reasons. He does see this opening in the heroin trade. And I think he really does use this transfer of power as an opportunity to elevate himself.
Looking to capitalize on his improved stature within the commission, Bonanno arranged a meeting back in Sicily.
So the meeting was really an occasion for Joe Bonanno to show off his so-called leadership. Joe Bonanno wanted to portray himself as a spokesperson for all of the Americans, the most important boss, the boss who could change everyone else's mind. So we do know that a lot of Americans were at the meeting in an attempt to set up an international, intercontinental business for drugs.
And the big question on the table is, how can we create an organization and a system by which we can import heroin from Europe into the United States?
And they basically divide up the world, so to speak, and come to an agreement about division of labor between Sicilian and American organized crime.
Bonanno and the bosses in Sicily came up with this idea. The Sicilians would bring the heroin into the States, and the Americans would tell them where there were good markets. So this was territory that the Sicilians had no knowledge. They needed guidance. And they brought it in, they packaged it very cheap, $5 and $10 bags. And the Americans, especially Bonanno, believed this was a good way of earning a buck without doing anything. The Mafia got a commission. They didn't have to do anything. The Sicilians were happy because they had a big market.
Meeting in Palermo, being able to make these connections with the Sicilian Mafia and solidify these transportation routes to get heroin into the United States is what he sees as his ticket forward. The drug trade in the 50s and 60s is interesting because the Mafia doesn't ever want to admit, even to themselves, that they're that involved in the drug trade. The 1950s, 60s, 90% of heroin is coming into the United States through the Italian-American Mafia.
Joe Bonanno and the five families' investment in the drug trade over the next several decades would ultimately become a tremendous burden. Members would choose to overlook the threat of law enforcement in favor of increased profits, a decision that would kill their organization from inside out, while devastating cities throughout the United States.
With this new flow of heroin onto the streets of America, Americans are going to take up heroin in a big way.
The most grievous sin that the Mafia in America committed is the damage that it did to the big cities. There was no heroin in Harlem. There was no heroin in the Lower East Side or in Brooklyn. And what it did was it destroyed the inner cities. And it's a sin that's still with us today.
To the naked eye, Joe Colombo was a businessman, an organizer, a public figure. But beneath the surface, he continued to lead one of New York's most powerful crime families, and he was sworn to a code of secrecy, a code that, if threatened, could cost him his life. As Joe Colombo's public exposure increased, the other bosses looked on uneasily. At the time, Carlo Gambino was the most tenured and respected boss in New York. Gambino and his allies in the Lucchese family had enthusiastically supported Colombo's Civil Rights League in the beginning. But word on the street was that the bosses were having second thoughts, that all the publicity was doing more harm than good. But Colombo was unperturbed. By this point, Joseph Colombo had been boss of a Mafia family for 7 years. He had come to power at the end of the Gallo-Profaci War, time of great conflict and uncertainty within the family. But he had successfully steadied the ship. It may have been his strong leadership qualities, or perhaps the fact that the family's biggest troublemaker, Joey Gallo, was stuck in jail. That was about to change, however. Crazy Joe would soon be back on the street, which meant trouble for Joe Colombo. While Joe Colombo and his league members prepared for their biggest rally yet, the Gallo crew down on President Street had other plans.
I hear what sounds like, to me, muted firecrackers. But people don't run from fireworks. People run from gunfire.
As Joseph Colombo is making his way through the crowd, a gunman approaches him and gets off 3 shots. Shoots him 3 times. Colombo collapses to the ground.
With Joe Colombo on life support and his survival unlikely, word began to spread in the underworld.
Then when somebody came and told us that Joe Colombo got shot, a lot of scuttlebutt about, right away that it was a Gallo. What are we gonna do? Who are you gonna reach out to? Go get a gun? What are we gonna do? It was a lot of, chaos.
Now here's the big million-dollar question. Is Jerome Johnson just a lone nut like Lee Harvey Oswald, or is he part of a greater conspiracy? This is, of course, what the mob thinks. And if there's anyone who they can look at and say is responsible for hiring Jerome Johnson to kill Joe Colombo, it's Crazy Joe Gallo.
April 1972, 1 month after The Godfather premiered in theaters, and less than a year after Joe Colombo was shot in broad daylight, Joey Gallo had a problem. He knew what his perception was among those in the 5 families. He was nuts, crazy, a liability, and likely the man behind the killing of Joe Colombo.
Joey was always making trouble in that family. It just escalated after the Colombo shooting.
There's an open hit out on Joey Gallo after the Colombo hit. The Colombo family's gonna get revenge.
And the word was out that Gallo was gonna get hit. I mean, I heard that. And that's why they told me, again, afterwards, not to go down to Little Italy at all, because he was known to go down there quite a bit. I said, stay away from everybody. As a matter of fact, don't come into Brooklyn for a while, because they didn't know how far this was gonna go. You're on the Colombo side. And so whether he was at fault or not, he was going.
He knew that he was in danger. Revenge in one form or another was imminent. But at least on the surface, Joey Gallo didn't seem to care.
Everybody was telling Joey just to stay low, not to walk around so freely, because we know there's open hit. And Joey said, no, they ain't got the balls to do it. That's exactly what his expression was. Them, they ain't got the balls to do it.
So Joey Gallo is basically walking around the streets of New York he's kind of the Walking Dead. At the same time, in the wake of the Godfather movies, he's become a celebrity because the Godfather's a hit. And all of a sudden, society types in New York City want to start hanging out with the real gangsters, especially a gangster who's as erudite and intelligent as Crazy Joe Gallo. Wow, these guys aren't really that bad. They're just on the other side of a system. So there's this sort of naive thinking in New York high society that makes Joey Gallo a bona fide celebrity.
Joey, would just disappear. He was running around the village, sightseeing, having coffee, talking to people. He would talk to anybody. He would just go up to you, hey, hello, hey, I'm Joey. He was very inquisitive that way and wanted to walk around and smell the roses and have a drink. Walk around and do what he wanted. He wasn't afraid.
Now, the problem is that you can't really be a media celebrity like Joey Gallo and still be in the Mafia. They don't like that. He's gonna spill all the Mafia secrets, this guy, and he just put a hit out on Boss Colombo. They're gonna get him one way or another, and I think Joey Gallo starts to know this.
April 7th, 1972, Joe Gallo's 43rd birthday. Against the advice of his crew members, Crazy Joe threw a party for himself at the Copacabana, a who's who of entertainers and socialites. Gallo was traveling with a party of 5, his wife Sina, his stepdaughter Lisa, his sister Carmela, his bodyguard Pete the Greek, and Pete's girlfriend Edith. It was a big party, and news traveled fast among the wise guys out that night. Joey Gallo was a sitting duck.
Joey Gallo is celebrating his birthday. He's just recently married. He's with his new wife, his 10-year-old daughter, and they've got a huge night planned. Any other mobster at this point with all of the heat on him is probably gonna lay low, celebrate quietly at home, go out of town. Not Gallo. He goes to the Copacabana, very high profile, very easy to spot.
They had seen a show, and afterwards they went to Umberto's clam shop in Little Italy, 4:30 in the morning. A Colombo guy had to get permission to do something. A high official in the Colombo family gave the okay. And they went through the kitchen of the restaurant, and they just started shooting. Gallo got up, tried to get out of the Umberto's, crawled to the door, and got out to the street.
Staggers out and drops dead.
We got a call maybe 7:30, and he goes, they killed Joey.
At about 5:30 this morning, it's the best that we can determine at the moment, an unidentified male walked in the side door, fired some shots, and then ran from the premises. Joe Gallo is dead, DOA, at Beekman Downtown Hospital.
A man walked in from the back door, and he walked up the side of the table. He fired 3 shots. He hit Joe twice, and he hit his bodyguard, Pete the Greek, 1 time.
No one knew really nothing until Pete the Greek got out of hospital. Pete the Greek was bodyguarding Joe that night, and Pete got shot in the ass, got arrested, but he went to the hospital, made bail, and got called right down to President Street. Who shot Joey? Pete the Greek turned around and said, the Sonny Pinto did.
When you have that breakdown in the official rules of the Mafia, it's easier to let anything slide. Instead of doing something in a way that's not going to affect the family, this is now just commonplace. You can kill someone in front of their wife and child, and that's an accepted part of doing business with the mob. The period of the 1970s, the continued violence that we see in New York, in a lot of ways becomes the undoing of these traditional mafia families.
The funeral for Joe Gallo was a scene. The sister roared out on the church steps in New York City would run red with blood over what happened to her brother.
A lot of people were there. A lot of people were hurting. A lot of people were mad. Joey was loved in the neighborhood. He was very generous. He was liked, Joey.
I'm not sure how to introduce my next guest. He's a businessman who leads a most colorful life. His name has been in the papers a great deal lately, and I just met him backstage. I'm anxious to meet him further. Will you welcome, please, Mr. Joseph Colombo, Sr.
In the spring of 1971, Joseph Colombo was the reputed boss of one of New York's 5 Mafia families, a title other men had held before. Yet, on this night, Colombo decided to go somewhere, do something no boss had done before. He was a guest on a late-night talk show.
I was wondering how you answer the people who constantly imply that you're associated with organized crime.
I would say it's distressing to all people. And I would also say that to associate anybody with organized crime and just label them or stigmatize them or guilt by association or guilt by innuendo is very unfair to anyone.
A mafia boss on a late-night show. Clearly, the 5 families were in a new era, but it was no accident. This was all a part of Joe Colombo's plan. A plan that started years earlier.
A great change is at hand. This is one country, and we owe ourselves a better country than that.
The 1960s is a tumultuous decade, to say the very least. There are all kinds of social movements taking place, principally the civil rights movement, where African Americans are demanding equality and full inclusion in American society. You have women, feminists, organizing for equality.
You also have the Vietnam War that's happening at this time. All of these things lead to a lot of Americans during this era no longer trusting the government.
At the same time, the 5 families, the core of the American Mafia, was in the midst of its own period of change. By 1963, 4 of the 5 original bosses were dead. And for the first time, one of New York's 5 families would be led by an American-born mafioso, Joseph Colombo.
In the early 60s, there was a deal where Joe Colombo, he was on a hit squad to go after Carlo Gambino. And rather than carry that out, he went and let Carlo know what was happening. And as a result of that, Joe Colombo was given the privilege of becoming boss. That's how he got it. Everybody thinks that we changed the names. It's the FBI that changes the names. We didn't call ourselves anything. They changed it from Profaci to Colombo.
Joseph Colombo, born and raised in South Brooklyn. Here, the Mafia wasn't just part of life, it was life. Colombo's father, Anthony, was a made man in the Profaci family. When Joe was 14, Anthony was found murdered in a car less than 2 miles from their home. By the time Joe was 40, he was a made man, a rising star in the Profaci family. He was feared, having killed at least a dozen men for the family. In 1961, when the Gallo brothers kidnapped a handful of Profaci's men, Joe Colombo was on their list. Trusted or feared, Colombo was the future. His close relationship to leaders on the commission like Carlo Gambino made him destined for the big time.
My father looked to Carlo like a father. Carlo Gambino was the most soft-spoken, gentleman, kind old man you ever met in your life. He had a European sense of chivalry. He was very unpretentious. They were men of few words. You knew their ethics, you knew their morals, you knew their sense of what was right and what was wrong.
Carlo Gambino was an old-school Don, a valuable mentor and a vital ally for Joe Colombo. But unlike his mentor and the Dons before him, Joe Colombo wasn't born in Sicily. He was born in America. And what's more American than putting a new twist on an old tradition? Joe Colombo had a new idea of what it meant to be a mob boss in New York City.
My name is Joe Colombo. I should be treated the same as anybody else.
Joe Colombo is just a much more sensible gangster. He's got a funeral parlor, he's got a car dealership. If someone wants to talk business and the cops show up, he's just saying, I'm just showing the guy a car. He's very business-oriented.
Joe Colombo was totally innovative about how he wanted to operate. He didn't escape from the media. He welcomed the media.
The reality is that Joe Colombo is still running these extortion rackets. His family is still involved in all of these traditional racketeering operations that the family has always participated in.
A lot of loan sharking, gambling, union activity. He, strangely enough, had his own gambling operation that he ran, which was very rare for the top guy. Usually their underlings are doing all that, but he actually ran it.
He was feared because of his past history of being a hitman, a murder-for-hire guy. He was very confident, as most hitmen are, always well-dressed, boastful.
And they have to make bosses for wherever they need scapegoats. I happen to be one of the scapegoats.
As Colombo rose in stature in the criminal underworld, investigators began to take note.
All of the federal focus on the Italian-American Mafia specifically does sort of give law enforcement this carte blanche to focus on Italian-American men. And even though there's mobsters of all ilks, there is this hyper-focus on the Italian-American Mafia.
The Justice Department began to send strike forces into various cities to attack organized crime. But many Italian-Americans began to protest that Italian-Americans were being singled out and that they were being harassed, that even their families had not escaped the prying of the FBI.
In the 1960s, Congress empowered the Justice Department, the FBI, federal law enforcement agencies to get court orders to authorize the electronic surveillance on telephones and placing bugs in premises where there were conversations about criminal activity ongoing.
Title III of the 1968 Crime Control Act allowed law enforcement to more aggressively surveil New York City's mob families, and the Colombo family in particular. Those around Colombo, like his underboss Sonny Francis, were under constant watch.
My dad was the underboss of the Colombo family back in the 60s, a very powerful position.
This man is John Sonny Francis. Francis, who has been arrested countless times, was described as a rising young lieutenant in the Brooklyn Mafia and one of the most dangerous mobsters in the country.
And my dad was extremely high profile in terms of media attention, law enforcement investigations. And he was arrested several times, indicted several times in the state of New York. So we had law enforcement around us all the time. They all had cars parked around our house, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
These women are the wives, sisters, and friends of the Colombo and Francis families. All of them claim the FBI is harassing their families.
Oh, you must be Joe Colombo's sister. Well, we want to get to your brother. Why? Why do you want to get to my brother? Well, we're going to put him away.
I grew up hating the police, hated law enforcement, hated the government. You know, I always saw them as harassing my dad, harassing my family.
We were all in a car. There were the seven children, and they said, "Go ahead, Sonny, do something to me." And the other one pulled a gun out of his pocket and said, "Go ahead, because I'm dying to do it."
Taking pictures or walking into your job, disrupting your place of business.
They get me upset because they sit in front of my house. They bother my husband.
Disrespectful at wakes, weddings, name it, they did it.
There is no such thing as a mafia. I'm supposed to be the sister of the biggest mafia in New York. I don't know what the word means. People want to know this about Joe Colombo? No. What they want to know about Joe Colombo, he's gangster. He's connected with every dirty thing there is. We, the family, know he isn't.
You gotta remember, this guy whacked out a lot of other mafia guys. That was his job in the Colombo family, was murder for hire. And he was hired by a lot of people, Gambino and others, to do those activities. He was a tough guy, and he was a fighter, and he wanted to fight back, and the investigative activity involving the Colombo family was pretty intense. They had a very strong squad, and it was a natural instinct. He saw the FBI coming at his family, and he fought back.
If there was one characteristic, one universal instinct of all men in the Mafia, it was to protect their families at all costs, to defend when necessary. Joe Colombo was no different. He realized early that the best defense was a good offense.
I say there's a conspiracy in this country against all Italian Americans. And I won't stop saying it until I feel that the father of our country treats us all like his children.
Mr. Colombo, are you a boss of the mafia? No, I am not. Is there a mafia? No, there is not.
John Joseph Gotti Jr. was the fifth of 13 children. A grandson of Neapolitan immigrants, he found his way as an adolescent on the streets of East New York. Car thefts, muggings. He developed a bit of a temper and a penchant for violence. By his teens, he fell in with a Gambino crew and found a mentor in Gambino underboss Neil Della Croce. Carlo Gambino, on his deathbed, passed over Della Croce and named Paul Castellano his successor as boss. Gotti was incredulous. So from the very beginning, there was a rift between John Gotti and Paul Castellano. A rift that only grew larger as Gotti expanded his gambling and loan sharking outfits while members of his crew built a drug trafficking operation. It was just a matter of time before one of them made a move, and John Gotti moved first.
Today, authorities say Gotti is being sought by the FBI for questioning in the murder of the two men who stood in his way for control of the Gambino family.
Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family, was killed because he was upset with John Gotti and his crew being involved in narcotics. Castellano didn't want any part of narcotics. Gotti did, because it made him money.
The killing of a mafia boss is very disruptive, obviously, to the Cosa Nostra. When Gotti kills Castellano, there are rumors about who supported it and who didn't. But as a result, Gotti was, in a lot of ways, anathema to a lot of the other mobsters.
We were concerned about Gotti, but not paying that much attention to him until December 1985, when he became the boss of the family. So he now becomes our #1 target. And with the Gambino squad, we're focusing on that.
Gotti is able to evade law enforcement for a few years, and it's a combination of having this network where he's able to insulate himself from specific crimes and specific offenses. There's also just this reality that he's untouchable.
It had been 6 years since New York City had seen a mob killing like this. Now prosecutors were forced to reckon with the fact that John Gotti had gotten to Paul Castellano before law enforcement could. And worst of all, he'd made a clean getaway. With minimal hard evidence linking Gotti to the hit, he took over control of the Gambino family with little restriction.
John Gotti bursts onto the scene in the American perception. Suddenly he's on the front page of the tabloids, and he's this persona right out of central casting.
John Gotti showed up at the right time in New York. You have more lavish parties happening at night. You've got bigger nightclubs. You've got more celebrities stepping out at night and, again, being photographed by the media. John Gotti is one of these guys that likes to be photographed by the paparazzi. He is called the Dapper Don.
One report said each suit cost $1,000. Gotti supposedly got angry. The suits cost $1,800.
Gotti was on the front page all the time, and the aura grows around him. The Brioni suits, and Andy Warhol does a portrait of him. He became a star. He's a murderer, he's a drug dealer, he's this and he's that. People loved him, you know what I mean? I think there's probably still people out in Howard Beach who still love him.
that's the best man around, and I'm 45 years old, the best man for me.
As far as Mr. Gotti goes, I've known him as a youngster and always as a gentleman. Whenever I see him walking, he always has a marvelous smile on his face. In fact, I admire the way he dresses.
He's always been a very respectable person in the community. And I find it very hard to believe what they're saying about him.
Gotti, more than anybody, was the guy who galvanized that image of the mobster in the 80s.
While the jury began to finally deliberate his case, John Gotti has apparently not lost his sense of humor.
What do you think? How come you don't listen to the tapes? How come you don't put the earphones on?
I like Julio Iglesias.
His contemporaries, however, knew that public displays of wealth and arrogance led to indictments and violence. It was another breach of their code. So while Gotti made headlines, members of other families watched begrudgingly from the shadows, namely his old ally from the Bonanno family, underboss Joseph Massino.
Massino and Gotti lived close together in the Howard Beach area, heavily residential, heavily Italian-American, and not far from JFK Airport, which explains some of the mob activities. It's an area with teachers, lawyers, and of course, infamously known for some of the mob characters who've lived there, among them being Joe Massino and John Gotti. They helped each other. Gotti's people helped Massino when they took care of the three captains. Helped them dispose of the bodies. But I don't think Gotti and Massino liked each other.
Joe Massino wanted to be the quiet Don. He did not want to have anybody know who he was. He didn't want anybody focusing on him. When he became the real full-time acknowledged boss, that's how he ran his family. He was really the antithesis of Gotti.
Massino felt that Gotti was not doing the right thing by the mob, but being too showy. And Gotti didn't think highly of Massino. He thought of him as a guy that was really under his thumb. Over time, they became antagonistic.
Through the 1990s, with most of the commission leadership in prison, New York's mob families scratched and clawed to keep money coming in. They worked in conjunction with one another to bleed money out of the most lucrative targets in New York City.
The major mob racket in New York is extorting money from legitimate businesses. And this is commonly called the mob tax. The 80s and the 90s are the height of this mob tax period. And this is really where we see that organized crime has infiltrated almost every industry of labor, every single element of the garment industry. There is a profit of about $500 million just from garbage hauling alone. New Yorkers pay about 35% more than fair market value just to get their garbage taken away. 1% to 2% tax by the mob, a tax on all windows being installed across the city. You're paying percentages off of every single window in a city that probably has the most windows of anywhere in North America.
In addition, it's alleged that the mob greases the wheels of the Fulton fish market, controls most of the private trash removal industry, runs hardcore pornography, drug trafficking, and portions of the film industry. It's the consumers who are picking up the tab.
After the Donnie Brasco infiltration of the family became public, it wasn't as if the Bonanno family ceased doing an operation. They continued to control the labor unions, bid rigging and extortion schemes. And their stature had been diminished in the world of organized crime.
As a result, they were not able to participate in some of these large-scale schemes that the other four families participated in. Since they got locked out of the more lucrative and more sophisticated operations, they became involved in other things. They accelerated their involvement with narcotics. They were sort of pioneers in getting into Wall Street. They do whatever works. The Post was a perfect example of targets of opportunity.
One of the Mafia's most successful ploys was the no-show job. The family would muscle control over a union or legitimate business and give high-ranking members of the family a job with a good salary, a job with benefits, a job that they didn't even have to show up for. Richard Cantarella, a captain in the Bonanno family, held one of these union jobs at the New York Post, one of the most circulated daily tabloids in New York City.
When I got involved, I had a no-show job, and nobody was going to say anything because of who I was. I was a tailman on a truck. That means I didn't do the driving, because if you are the driver, there's no way you could not show up. So I was the tailman, and at the end of the week, I took care of the driver. I did very well. I was getting paid. There's always gambling going on. So if that was going on by somebody in the Post, they'd have to give up a piece of that money, or we're not going to allow you to do it. Any gambling, any stealing, any lending of money, we had to get a piece of it. And I always managed to stay on the books someplace. Now I'm on Social Security. At that point, I got involved in taking over one of the parking lots in the Marine and Aviation. In New York, parking is a commodity. Parking was big.
Parking lots would be a good opportunity for organized crime, especially back in the 80s and the 90s, because there was less electronic bookkeeping, as it were. But back then, it was largely a cash business. Not all of it makes it to the accounting books so that you don't have to pay taxes on all of it. So a lot of it goes right into your pocket. It's a hard thing to audit when you don't have the controls of how many cars are going in, how many cars are going out.
From nothing, I wound up with 22 locations. I wound up having a home built. Parking was very good to me.
Richard Cantarella was bringing in serious money for the Bonanno family and building a comfortable life for his nuclear family out in Staten Island. For Richard's son, Paul, the riches that the life provided were too good to pass up.
But as a kid, they always knew it was Richie's son, and I always got respect. Instead of going to summer camp, I would want to go with my father to Manhattan. And I would go with him to the parking lot and the newsstand. And then from there, we would work our way to Mulberry Street. There was all business, restaurants, parking lots, you know, big Mercedes, always dressed nice. I just saw the respect on the block, you know, and who doesn't want to be like that? It was the greatest thing you could see. I just was so loyal to them, and I looked up to them that whatever they wanted me to do, I would do. And so they decided to bring me in. I got made.
Me and Sal became very close. Actually, probably closer my son was to Sal Vitale. He's the one who promoted me to make my son. He said, why don't you put your son's name in?
It wound up being in my mother's basement. Joe Messina was there, Sal Vitale, Frankie, Lino, my father, and a few guys that were gonna get made. They pretty much explained that it's a brotherhood, and then they explained a couple of the rules. You don't pick up your hands to any made guys, and you don't fool around with anybody's wife. That's your father, you know, Joe Messina now. You know, any problems, you go to him. Joe was a real deal. You know who he was, and my father always taught me, you don't ask any questions, you do what he asks, you don't do anything behind his back, and you don't have to worry. You know, people went missing and you didn't ask a question.